Sawere, welcome to Born Extinct, my journey to acknowledgement of my ancestors and authentic spiritual self. My name is Attire, and I was born extinct. Tomorrow is Heritage Day in South Africa. Many Khoi and San people will be wondering what they would be wearing tomorrow, since we were classified coloured. Some years ago, my Zulu neighbour announced to me that her children will be going to school as coloureds, just like mine, as she's not making an effort to dress her 3 girls. After much arrogance about how her girls will be going to school wearing jeans, she asked me what my girls would be wearing. My response was that they would be wearing traditional attire. She dismissed me. It would take me several years to confront her about her ignorance, and even then, it went way over her head. African dress predates contact with European, Asian, and Middle Eastern people. This is evident in the rock art of southern, northern, and eastern Africa. Studies suggest that Africans started wearing clothing from around 180,000 years ago, during the onset of the Ice Age. Early clothes was made of leather and fur. What Africans wear relates to their physical environment. Factors like the desert of the Sahara, arid conditions of the Namib and the Karoo, the rainforests in Western Central Africa, the mountains of Lesotho and the Great Rift Valley influences our dress. European illustrations of the Cape and Khoi and San describes us as a particularly ugly race of people. I resemble my ancestors, and I don't see what the settler sees when I look at my own reflection. My ancestors were very extravagant and flamboyant dresses, despite the European narrative that they wore nothing more than a few dirty pieces of animal skin. Our forebears dressed and adorned their attire according to their status, gifts, and position in community. Indigenous people in the Cape wore skins of sheep and other animals tied around the shoulders and smaller ones around the hips. These loincloths were decorated with copper beads, and they made sounds as they walked. The women wore longer ones, up to 6 or 7 different animal skins, depending on the weather, and elaborately decorated skirts. Khoi women usually wore several strings of beads, with the most popular being red and yellow, ivory on their fingers and arms, and heavy metal earrings. Both men and women wore jewelry made of ivory, copper, berries, bones, ostrich shells. Around their necks they wore little bags containing little knife, tobacco, dacha, herbs for medicinal use, etc. Sometimes they wore sandals. They always had a kiri. Hair was ornamented with copper beads and white shells. They would sometimes wear a hat with an ornamental piece of glass bead in the center. Their shoes, still around today, the veldskoen, was made of a flat piece of rhino skin or double ox hide tied together with 2 pieces of leather. Leather handbags with tassels were worn by both male and females. In these bags they carried tortoise shells with animal fats, herbs, definitely buchu, and other medicinal herbs. The Cape Khoi smeared their bodies and often their entire attire with animal fats. Their faces were smeared with clay and soot from fires, and then patterns were made with their fingernails. Indigenous clothing was a visual symbolic marker of our spirituality and culture, and the very obstacle to the success of the colonial project. For the colonizer, the imposition of European clothing was an assertion of all things superior from Europe and the presumption of an eager acceptance by the locals of foreign cultures. British and Dutch often mapped and organized people according to their attire, and therefore did not allow those subservient to them to wear shoes. Western civilization set the standard of dress in these foreign outposts to ensure the difference between colonizer and its subjects. Westerners, when visiting or living in these colonies or traveling through the African bushveld, made a point of dressing in full European attire. This trend, continuing to this day, suggests the willingness to endure discomfort in order to be viewed as morally and culturally superior. Although Europeans in earlier encounters adopted local dress, colonial dress became increasingly rigid and formal, and eventually cross-cultural dressing or going native became offensive to the standards of the ruling groups. Women in the colonial world were more resistant to adopting non-traditional clothes. For women of the brand new upper classes, it was a sign of sophistication. For the colonized, dressed and self-adornment is associated with spiritual and ancestral significance. The wearer derives spiritual power and nourishment from wearing them. African attire communicate age, occupation, ethnicity, and power. The wearing of identical dress emphasized group affiliation. The missionaries focused on the eradication of cultural dress, as most indigenous clothing includes some form of nudity and adds significant meaning to the colonizer and not to the wearer. The struggle for the souls involved forcing indigenous people into European clothing to manage nakedness, seeing it as a new moral economy of mind and body. The eradication of traditional dress was meant to undermine our spiritual, emotional, and physical bonds sustained through these garments. It caused deep-seated loss of spirituality, personal and communal dignity, which made it easier for them to destroy our lifestyle and our languages. Body modification also predates the colonial period, and permanent markings like scarifications was replaced with temporary cosmetics like ochre, indigo, henna, and chalk. In South Africa, Afrikaners still wear European dress like khaki, hunting, and explorer garb. This continues their European heritage, while other European settlers and non-Africans have embraced more local themes. The elimination of traditional clothing was seen as a success of cultural assimilation and colonization. The colonial dress symbolizes an identity tied to the colonizer. Where colonial leaders found indigenous dress a potential for resistance and oppression, this dress was aggressively discouraged. Highly decorated military uniforms was worn by kings and paramount chiefs, accessorized with ostentatious medals and animal skins to show how reasonable the colonial ruler was. Pre-shaped clothing came with a contact with the European, as women adopted fitted skirts, jackets, trousers, and shirts. In the post-colonial era, the stereotypical and belligerent depictions of indigenous attire is often underpinned by political correct language. Whether it is the shuka worn by the Kenyan and Tanzanian Maasai, the Cameroonian tohu, the sari worn by women in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, the Japanese kimono, the huipil of Central America and Mexico, we indigenous people have always worn our identity despite the colonial distaste for it. The demonization of the burqa, worn by Muslim women, is but one of the most recent examples of Western nations using old tactics of imperial oppression in this post-colonial era. Political ideas such as these, claiming liberation of women from their traditional dress, are far too familiar in evoking the old colonial mission of the white man's burden. These post-colonial attitudes stem from historical dynamics between the colonized and the colonial subject. It is therefore obvious that the betterment of the native are measured by progress towards European dress. In fact, that traditional clothing are still the object of racial profiling and otherness should trigger extreme concern, especially on the African continent. The portrayal of the Khoi and San as cannibalistic savages was only intended for ideological exploitation. Kai Gagangs for your time, Cape of Storms, Table Bay, Falls Bay, Cape of Good Hope, Settler, it was not yours to take. I am Attire, and I was born extinct.